Have you ever been fired while presenting the product you built from scratch? What if I told you I just nodded, thanked them, and 12 days later, sold a patent worth $1.4 billion to their biggest competitor? This is not a story about luck. It is about a woman who was publicly humiliated but silently prepared. The climax is not the firing. It is the signature that made a tech empire collapse in exactly 12 days. My name is Ivy Sanders. I am 38 years old, and until exactly 5 minutes ago, I was the Chief Innovation Officer of Nova Shield Dynamics here in the bustling corporate heart of Brighton Falls. I was standing at the head of a massive mahogany table that likely cost more than the tuition for my first 2 years of college. The glass walls of the executive conference room reflected the gray, overcast skyline behind me, creating a cold and imposing backdrop for what was supposed to be a celebration of success. On the 80-inch screen directly behind my back, the words Aegis Lock Expansion Strategy were still glowing in crisp, confident blue letters. Underneath the title, my name was displayed in a slightly smaller, elegant font. I had spent the last 18 months of my life breathing life into Aegis Lock. To the board members sitting in their ergonomically perfect leather chairs, it was a high-margin product. To the market, it was a revolutionary biometric authentication platform. But to me, it was something far more personal. It was my child. It was my masterpiece. I had written the original kernel code on my kitchen table while eating cold takeout at 3 in the morning. I had led the team that debugged the neural network integration when everyone said it was impossible. I had slept under my desk during the beta launch to ensure the servers held up. Aegis Lock was the reason Nova Shield was currently valued at a figure that made Wall Street analysts salivate. I was midway through explaining the slide on projected third-quarter revenue growth, gesturing to the upward curve that represented thousands of hours of my team's hard work. When the sound cut through the room, it was a sharp, final clack. It sounded like a gunshot equipped with a silencer, or perhaps more accurately, the closing of a heavy casket lid. Gregory Thorne, our newly appointed CEO, had just slammed his laptop shut. Gregory was a man who wore suits that cost $5,000 and spoke in a language composed entirely of hollow buzzwords like synergy and paradigm shift. He had come from a background in high-level strategic consulting, which in my experience meant he knew how to gut a company to make the balance sheet look pretty for a single quarter before moving on to his next victim. He did not look at the screen. He did not look at the board members who were leaning forward, captivated by the roadmap I had laid out. He looked directly at me. "Ivy," he said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a cold weight that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. Effective immediately, you are relieved of all duties and responsibilities at Nova Shield. Security is waiting outside to escort you to your vehicle. Time did not just slow down in that room, it stopped completely. I saw the director of marketing freeze with his porcelain coffee cup halfway to his mouth, the steam still rising in a delicate swirl. I saw the board chairwoman blink rapidly, her pen hovering uncertainly over her notepad. The silence was absolute. It was heavy and suffocating. This was not a standard termination. This was a public execution. Gregory could have called me into his office later that afternoon. He could have done this quietly on a Friday evening to minimize the drama. But he chose to do it here, in the middle of my presentation, in front of the entire board of directors. It was a play for dominance. It was pure theater. He was signaling to everyone in that room that the old guard was gone, and that no amount of technical brilliance could save you if you did not fit his new vision of cost-cutting and lean operation. My heart should have been pounding out of my chest. I should have felt the hot flush of shame creeping up my neck, burning my ears. I should have been screaming. I had built this division from zero. I had fought for every engineer on my team when the previous CFO wanted to outsource development to the lowest bidder. And now, this man, who could not tell the difference between a firewall and a toaster, was discarding me like a used wrapper. But strangely, I did not feel the urge to scream. I looked at Gregory. I held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. I searched his eyes for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of humanity, or even a basic understanding of what he was throwing away. There was nothing, just cold, Flat calculation. He saw me as a line item on a spreadsheet that he had just successfully deleted. He saw a salary he could redistribute to boost his EBITDA targets for the upcoming fiscal year. He had absolutely no idea what I had actually built. He had no idea how the architecture of Aegis Lock worked or the delicate ecosystem of licenses that kept it running. I slowly reached out and disconnected the HDMI cable from my laptop. The screen behind me went black, plunging the room into a slightly dimmer light. I closed my notebook. I capped my pen. I placed them neatly into my leather bag. The silence stretched on, becoming painful for everyone except me. They were waiting for the explosion. They were waiting for me to beg, to argue, to cite my employment contract, to remind them that I was the only person in the building who understood the core encryption protocols. I did none of those things. I slung my bag over my shoulder and stood up straight. I smoothed the front of my blazer. I looked Gregory dead in the eye and said 2 words. Thank you. It was soft. It was polite. It was final. I saw a flicker of confusion twitch at the corner of his mouth. He had expected resistance. He had prepared for a fight, for a scene that would justify his description of me as difficult or emotional. My acceptance threw him off balance for a nanosecond, but he quickly recovered, nodding dismissively as he turned his attention back to the board. Already preparing to spin the narrative of my departure, I turned and walked out of the glass doors. I did not look back at the colleagues I had mentored for years. I did not look at the board members who had toasted my success at the Christmas party 3 months ago. I walked past the security guard who was awkwardly waiting by the elevator, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. I pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors slid shut, cutting off the view of the Nova Shield logo etched into the frosted glass wall, I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. My hands were not shaking. Now, let me ask you something. If you were in my shoes, at that exact moment, what would you have done? Be honest with yourself. Would you have slammed your fist on the table? Would you have shouted about the injustice of it all until security dragged you out? Would you have cried in the elevator on the way down to the parking garage? Watching the numbers drop from floor 42 to the basement, it is a natural reaction. We are taught that when we are wronged, we should fight back immediately. We are taught that silence is submission. We are taught to defend our honor. But here's the thing about corporate warfare that Gregory Thorne did not understand. Sometimes, the loudest move you can make is absolute silence. Sometimes, you nod and say thank you because you know something they do not. You see, when I said thank you, I was not thanking him for firing me. I was thanking him for pulling the trigger before he checked the safety mechanism. I was thanking him for being so arrogant, so focused on his power play, that he forgot to read the fine print of the intellectual property agreement we signed 3 years ago during the liquidity crisis. Most people think being fired is the end of the road. You hand over your badge, you sign the separation agreement, and you go home to update your resume while wondering where it all went wrong. You feel small. You feel replaceable. That is exactly how they want you to feel. They want you to feel like a cog that has been swapped out. But as I walked across the polished marble floor of the lobby, listening to the click of my heels echoing in the vast, empty space, I did not feel small. I felt dangerous. Gregory thought he had just cut off a limb to save the body. He did not realize he had just decapitated the entire organism. He thought the power remained in that boardroom on the 42nd floor. He was wrong. The power was currently riding the elevator down to the parking garage, carrying a leather satchel and a very specific knowledge about who actually owned the rights to the underlying code of Aegis Lock. I walked out into the bright, blinding sunlight of a Tuesday afternoon in Brighton Falls. The air smelled of exhaust and expensive coffee. I unlocked my car, tossed my bag onto the passenger seat, and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. I looked up at the towering glass monolith of the Nova Shield building. From down here, it looked impenetrable, a fortress of industry and innovation, but I knew the structural weakness in its foundation because I was the one who had poured the concrete. They had just kicked out the only architect who knew where the load-bearing walls were. And more importantly, they had just kicked out the landlord. I started the engine. The radio hummed to life, playing some generic pop song that felt miles away from my reality. I did not drive home immediately. I just sat there, watching the executives and employees trickle in and out of the revolving doors, oblivious to the fact that the company they worked for was effectively a zombie. It was dead. It just had not fallen over yet. A normal person would be panic-stricken about their mortgage or their health insurance. And sure, a small part of me was doing the math on my savings. But the bigger part of me, the part that had built a billion-dollar product from scratch, was feeling a sensation that was almost like excitement. It was the cold clarity of a chess player who sees mate in 5 moves while their opponent is still celebrating taking a pawn. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the garage. I had work to do, not for Nova Shield, but for myself. The meeting in the boardroom was not the end of the story. It was simply the opening scene. And as I merged onto the highway, leaving the skyline of Brighton Falls behind me in the rearview mirror, I knew one thing for certain. Gregory Thorne had wanted a show. He had wanted to demonstrate his power. Well, I thought as I tapped the steering wheel to the rhythm of the road, he was going to get a show, just not the one he bought a ticket for. The drive down to the underground parking garage felt like a descent into the underworld. The fluorescent lights flickered with a sickly yellow hum, casting long, wavering shadows against the concrete walls. I found my car parked exactly where I had left it that morning, a silver sedan that now seemed to belong to a stranger. I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. But I did not start the engine. I just sat there. The silence in the car was absolute. It was a vacuum. Just an hour ago, I was the Chief Innovation Officer, a title that carried weight and commanded respect. Now, sitting in the recycled air of the garage, I felt like a machine that had been abruptly unplugged from the wall. The lights were still on, but the power was gone. My hands gripped the steering wheel, not to drive, but to have something solid to hold on to while the world spun quietly around me. I did not cry. That was the strangest part. I expected tears, or rage, or some cinematic release of emotion. Instead, I felt a profound numbness. It was as if my brain was trying to process a fatal system error and had decided to shut down all non-essential functions to preserve the core. I drove home on autopilot, navigating the traffic of Brighton Falls without really seeing the other cars. When I walked into my apartment, I did not turn on the lights. I dropped my keys on the counter, kicked off my heels, and collapsed onto the sofa. The city lights from the window painted stripes across the floor, and I watched them move as the hours ticked by, feeling entirely disconnected from the timeline of my own life. The next morning, the numbness began to wear off, replaced by the sharp, stinging reality of the digital world. I woke up not to an alarm, but to the vibration of my phone on the nightstand. It was relentless. It buzzed and danced across the wood surface like an angry insect. I rolled over and picked it up. The screen was a cascade of notifications, a timeline of panic unfolding in real time within the engineering department of Nova Shield. Malik, my lead systems architect, was the first. His message was time-stamped at 6:45 in the morning. He asked if they were still allowed to access the Aegis Lock core repository. He said the credentials for the senior team were bouncing back with permission errors. I felt a pang of guilt in my chest. Malik had a mortgage and twins on the way. I had promised him stability when he turned down an offer from a major tech giant to stay with us. Then came a message from Erin, our head of quality assurance. She said that Human Resources had just sent a memo stating that all high-level access rights were temporarily frozen pending a leadership structural review. She asked what was going on. She asked if I was okay. I could not bring myself to reply. What could I say? That I had failed them, that the captain had been thrown overboard, and now they were sailing into a storm with a man who thought the cloud was just something in the sky. I scrolled down, reading the confusion and the fear in their words. I had spent years building a shield around this team. I fought against impossible deadlines. I fought against budget cuts that would have forced us to release buggy software. I fought for their bonuses. I was their firewall. And now, the firewall was gone, and they were exposed to the raw, unfiltered incompetence of Gregory Thorne. I put the phone down and stared at the ceiling. The doubt started to creep in then. It was a cold, insidious voice in the back of my head. Maybe Gregory was right. Maybe I had become too attached. Maybe I was just a relic of the startup phase, a necessary cost that had grown too expensive for the scaling phase. I wondered if I had been naive to believe that talent and dedication were enough to protect you in corporate America. I had believed that if you built something valuable, you became valuable. But looking at my dark apartment and my silent email inbox, I felt incredibly foolish. I was not an asset. I was a depreciated resource. I picked up the phone again, intending to turn it off, to sever the connection completely. That was when I saw the message from Talia. Talia was a junior developer, barely 2 years out of college. She was quiet, diligent, and mostly tasked with bug testing and minor interface patches. She rarely spoke up in meetings unless directly asked. Her message was short, buried under the panic of the senior staff. She asked if anyone upstairs actually knew who held the original patent rights. My thumb hovered over the screen. My heart skipped a beat. It was a physical sensation, a hard thump against my ribs. I read the message again. It seemed like a naive question, the kind of thing a junior employee might ask out of confusion. But for me, it was a lightning bolt. It cut through the fog of self-pity and shame instantly. Who held the original patent rights? The question hung in the air of my living room. I sat up straight, the blanket falling off my shoulders. My mind, which had been sluggish and gray, suddenly snapped into high gear. I closed my eyes and let my memory drift back 3 years. 3 years ago, Nova Shield was not the industry titan it is today. We were bleeding cash. The first iteration of our software had failed to gain traction, and the investors were circling like vultures, ready to strip the company for parts. We had 2 months of runway left before bankruptcy. That was the summer I wrote the core architecture for Aegis Lock. It was a desperate Hail Mary pass. I remembered the smell of the old conference room, the one with the stained carpet and the broken air conditioning. I remembered the exhausted faces of the board members. They needed my code. They needed Aegis Lock to work, or they would all lose their investments. But the company had no money to pay me the bonus I deserved, and they certainly had no money to guarantee my severance if the company folded. So, I had proposed a trade. I told them I would forego my bonus and take a salary cut for the next fiscal year to help with the cash flow. In exchange, I wanted to restructure the intellectual property holding. I remembered the stack of paperwork. I remembered the weary nod of the chairman, who just wanted to sign anything that would keep the lights on for another month. I remembered Gregory Thorne's predecessor, a tired man who barely read the documents before scribbling his signature. They had been so focused on survival, so focused on the immediate cash flow, that they had looked at the deal as a victory for them. They saved $200,000 in immediate salary costs. They thought they were getting a bargain. I opened my eyes. The apartment didn't look dark anymore. It looked like a command center. Talia, the quiet junior developer, had just asked the one question that Gregory Thorne, in all his arrogant brilliance, had never bothered to ask. He assumed that because he bought the company, he bought everything inside it. He assumed that because I was an employee, everything I created belonged to him in perpetuity. I stood up and walked to the closet in the hallway. I pushed aside the coats and the vacuum cleaner until I found a plastic bin filled with old documents. I dug through tax returns and old utility bills until I felt the thick, textured paper of a legal envelope. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline. I pulled out the document. It was the restructuring agreement from 3 years ago. I flipped past the first few pages, past the definitions and the standard liability clauses. I found the section I was looking for. It was near the end, in a paragraph that looked like standard boilerplate text. I read the words, and a chill went down my spine. It was a good chill. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there, in that glass tower, Gregory was probably sitting in his office, feeling powerful. He was probably planning how to divide up my office and my budget. He thought he had won. He thought he had cleared the board. I looked down at the paper in my hand again. Talia was right. They did not know. They had no idea. I turned my attention to you. the person watching this, or reading this, let me ask you a question. When you sign an employment contract, or a loan agreement, or a terms of service update, do you read every single line? Do you read the boring parts at the very bottom? The parts written in size 8 font that seem to go on forever? Or do you just scroll down and click accept because you are busy and you trust that everything is standard? Gregory Thorne did exactly what 99% of people do. He skipped the boring parts. He looked at the bold headers and the dollar signs. He ignored the fine print. And that, my friends, was going to be the most expensive mistake of his life. Because in that fine print, buried under legal jargon and subordinate clauses, was a ticking time bomb. And I was the only one holding the detonator. By midnight, my small apartment in downtown Brighton Falls had ceased to be a home. It had transformed into a war room. The dining table, usually reserved for my solitary dinners or the occasional stack of unread mail, was now buried under a geological layering of paperwork. There were employment addendums, non-disclosure agreements, vesting schedules, and patent filings. I had dragged a whiteboard out of the closet, one I had not used since my graduate school days, and propped it up against the television. The air in the room was stale, smelling of printer toner and the cold, bitter coffee I had been sipping for 4 hours straight. The only light came from a single yellow desk lamp that cast long, sharp shadows across the floor, turning the piles of paper into a miniature, chaotic city. I was not crying anymore. I was not panicking. I was hunting. I was looking for a ghost. Specifically, I was looking for the ghost of a decision I had made 3 years ago, during the darkest winter of Nova Shield's history. It was a time we referred to internally as the bleeding season. We were hemorrhaging cash, investors were fleeing, and the board was discussing liquidation. I closed my eyes and let the memory wash over me. It was a Tuesday in November. The rain had been hammering against the windows of our old office building. I was sitting across from our former general counsel, a man named Marcus, who was too tired to argue and too underpaid to care. I had just finished the architecture for the Aegis Lock kernel, but the company could not afford to pay for the final patent registration fees, nor could they guarantee my salary for the next 6 months. They needed my code to secure the next round of funding, but they were asking me to work on faith. I was young, but I was not stupid. I knew that faith did not pay the rent, so I had made a counteroffer. I told Marcus I would cover the registration costs myself and defer 30% of my salary. In exchange, the intellectual property for the core biometric algorithm would not be registered directly to Nova Shield Dynamics. Instead, it would be registered to a separate holding entity I had formed the night before, a limited liability company called Aurora Cipher Labs. Nova Shield would have an exclusive, perpetual, royalty-free license to use the technology, as long as I remained the primary architect. It was a safety net. It was a way to ensure that if the ship went down, my life's work would not be sold off as scrap metal in a bankruptcy auction. Marcus had barely glanced at the paperwork. He just wanted the deal done so he could tell the board we had the IP secured. He signed it, the chairman signed it, and then, because the company survived and thrived, everyone forgot about it, everyone except me. I opened my eyes and looked at the mountain of paper on my floor. Somewhere in this mess was the signed execution copy of that agreement. I started digging. I tossed aside quarterly reports and HR memos. My hands moved with a mechanical precision, fueled by a mix of adrenaline and cold rage. I found it at 2 a.m. It was inside a plain manila envelope that had been shoved into the back of a folder labeled Miscellaneous Tax Documents. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges. I pulled it out and smoothed it flat on the table, pushing aside a half-empty mug of coffee. My finger traced the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. I scanned past the definitions of service, past the liability waivers, past the dispute resolution clauses, and then I stopped. There it was. Section 14, Paragraph B, Subsection 2. The text was dry, boring, and utterly lethal. It read, "In the event that the employment of the chief architect is terminated involuntarily without cause, or in the event of a change in executive leadership structure that results in the material diminution of the architect's role." The exclusive license granted herein to Nova Shield Dynamics shall immediately and automatically terminate. All rights, titles, and interests in the core IP shall revert fully to Aurora Cipher Labs LLC until such time as a new licensing agreement is negotiated and executed in writing by both parties. I read it once, then I read it again, then I read it a third time, whispering the words out loud to the empty room just to hear how they sounded. The silence in the apartment changed. It was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a bomb squad watching the timer tick down to 0, knowing exactly which wire to cut. I sat back in my chair and let the reality of what had happened wash over me. Gregory Thorne, with his MBA and his expensive suit and his arrogance, had walked into that boardroom and fired me. He thought he was cutting costs. He thought he was removing an obstacle. But because he had not bothered to read the foundational documents of the technology stack he was so proud of, he had done something else entirely. By saying the words "effective immediately," Gregory had not just fired an employee, he had legally severed the connection between Nova Shield and its flagship product. The license was dead. It had died the moment I walked out of that room. Currently, at this very second, the entire Aegis Lock platform was running on borrowed time. It was running on software that Nova Shield no longer had the legal right to use. Every server login, every client authentication, every biometric scan being processed by their systems was now, technically, an act of copyright infringement and unauthorized use of protected intellectual property. A cold, sharp laugh escaped my lips. It was a sound I barely recognized. I stood up and walked over to the whiteboard. I uncapped a red marker. In the center of the board, I drew a small, solid circle. I wrote the words, Aurora Cipher Labs, inside it. Around that circle, I drew a larger, dashed ring. I labeled it Aegis Lock Core. Then, completely separate from those two, I drew a large, wobbly square on the outside. I labeled it Nova Shield. For the last 3 years, the line connecting Nova Shield to the core had been solid. It was the license agreement. But tonight, Gregory had taken a pair of scissors to that line. He had cut it. I drew a big red X over the connection line. I stepped back and looked at the diagram. It was beautiful in its simplicity. Gregory thought he owned the house because he held the keys to the front door. He did not realize that I owned the land the house was built on, and the lease had just expired. I looked at the clock. It was almost 3 in the morning. My phone was still buzzing occasionally with messages from the team. But I did not look at them. I could not help them yet. They were passengers on a sinking ship, and I was the lighthouse keeper watching from the shore. I felt a pang of sympathy for Malik and Aaron, and even for the junior developers who would be waking up to chaos soon. But that sympathy was quickly overshadowed by a new, steely resolve. They thought they had disposed of me. They thought I was trash. They thought I would go home, update my LinkedIn profile, and beg for a reference letter. I walked to the window and looked out at the city skyline. I could see the faint outline of the Nova Shield building in the distance, a dark obelisk against the night sky. Inside that building, servers were humming, data was flowing, millions of dollars were moving through the digital veins of the system I had built, and all of it belonged to me. I was not just an unemployed woman in a messy apartment anymore. I was the CEO of Aurora Cipher Labs. I was the sole proprietor of a $1.4 billion asset, and the company that had just humiliated me was currently squatting on my property. I turned back to the table and looked at the contract one last time. I picked up a pen and circled the date at the bottom of the page. It was the date the ticking clock began. Gregory Thorne wanted a war. He wanted a display of power. He wanted to show the world that he was the alpha in the room. I capped the red marker with a satisfying click. He had no idea that he had just handed me the remote control to his entire empire. And the best part was, he had no idea where the off switch was. But I did. I knew exactly where it was, because I had wired it myself. I turned off the desk lamp, plunging the room into darkness. For the first time in 48 hours, I felt a wave of genuine, restful exhaustion. I could sleep now. I needed my rest, because tomorrow, or the day after, or whenever the system finally realized the license was gone, The real show was going to begin, and I wanted to be wide awake when the lights went out at Nova Shield. It had been exactly 9 days since I walked out of that boardroom. 9 days of radio silence from me. 9 days of frantic, chaotic noise from inside Nova Shield. I was sitting in my living room, curled up in an oversized gray hoodie and thick wool socks, looking nothing like the corporate executive I used to be. My expensive blazers were hanging in the closet, gathering dust. On the coffee table in front of me, my old laptop was humming. The screen split into 2 distinct windows. On the left was the public live stream of the Nova Shield Investor Day, broadcast in high definition from the company's gleaming new auditorium. On the right was something much less polished, but infinitely more interesting. It was a window into the company's internal engineering chat channel. When the IT department revoked my email access, they had been thorough, but they had forgotten one small, crucial detail. My access to the developer chat server was tied to a legacy admin token I had created for emergency debugging 4 years ago. It was a backdoor key that bypassed the standard single sign-on protocols. So, while Gregory Thorne was preparing to dazzle the world, I was sitting there, reading every panicked message his engineering team was typing. The messages were flying by so fast I could barely read them. Malik posted a message asking if anyone had stress-tested the live environment. Aaron replied that Gregory had insisted on a live demo using the main production server to show off the real-time speed. She said he called it a display of raw power. Talia, my sharp-eyed junior developer, simply typed that she had a bad feeling about this. I took a sip of tea and looked at the left side of my screen. The camera panned over the audience. It was a packed house. Venture capitalists, tech reporters, and industry analysts filled the plush seats. They were there to see if the rumors of internal instability were true, and Gregory was there to prove them wrong. He needed to close a funding round worth 9 figures to keep the company afloat. He looked impeccable. His suit was tailored to within an inch of its life. His teeth were white. His confidence was radiating off the screen like heat. He stepped up to the podium, the lights dimming to focus solely on him and the massive screen behind him. He spoke about the future. He spoke about security without compromise. He used the word synergy at least 4 times in the first 3 minutes. Then came the moment of truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gregory announced, his voice booming with theatrical gravity, "I give you the future of biometric authentication. I give you the unbridled power of Aegis Lock." He turned to the console on the podium. Behind him, the massive screen displayed the sleek, dark interface of the Aegis Lock dashboard. It was my design. It was my code. Seeing it there, being paraded by the man who fired me, felt like watching a stranger driving my stolen car. Gregory typed in a command to initiate a live, global verification test. "Watch," he said, pointing to the screen. "Watch as we process 10 million secure authentications in under 5 seconds. He hit the enter key. The audience leaned forward. The investors held their breath. On the screen, a loading bar appeared. It spun again, and then it stopped. It did not crash. The screen did not go black. There was no blue screen of death. Instead, the sleek dashboard vanished, replaced instantly by a stark, white command line box in the center of the giant display. The text was black, bold, and horrifyingly simple. License authorization expired. Below that, in slightly smaller text, was the instruction that froze the blood of every executive in the room. Contact Aurora Cipher Labs, LLC for renewal. I leaned back in my chair. The name of my holding company, the one I had created in that messy apartment 3 years ago, was now projected in 10-foot-tall letters behind the CEO of Nova Shield. On the live stream, I saw Gregory smile. It was a tight, frozen smile. He chuckled nervously into the microphone. "It seems we have a minor display glitch," he said, his voice straining to remain calm. If the technical team could just refresh the feed. He hit the escape key. Nothing happened. He hit it again. The message remained, on the right side of my laptop. The chat window exploded. Malik typed in all caps, asking what the hell Aurora Cipher Labs was. Aaron replied that the server was rejecting all commands. She said the root directory was locked. Talia posted a single line that made me smile. She said it was not a bug. She said it was a feature. Back in the auditorium, the silence was stretching thin. 5 minutes passed. Gregory was now visibly sweating under the stage lights. He was tapping furiously at the keyboard, abandoning his composed persona. Tech support staff were running onto the stage, hunched over, plugging and unplugging cables. But every time the screen refreshed, the message came back, relentless and unyielding. License authorization expired. 10 minutes passed. The polite silence of the audience had turned into a murmur of confusion. Phones were coming out. People were taking pictures of the screen. The hashtag #NovaShieldFail was probably already trending on social media. 20 minutes passed. The demo was dead in the water. Then, the final nail in the coffin was hammered in. In the front row of the auditorium, a man stood up. I recognized him immediately. It was the chief operating officer, a man who had survived 3 different CEOs by being cautious and observant. He was not looking at the screen. He was looking at Gregory. He did not use a microphone, but the auditorium was so quiet that his voice carried clearly over the live stream. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Gregory, are you telling us that we do not own the license to the core product?" The question hung in the air like toxic smoke. It shattered the illusion instantly. Gregory froze. He looked at the COO, then back at the screen, and for the first time, the arrogance vanished. In its place was the terrified realization of a man who had walked off a cliff without checking if he had a parachute. "We are handling it," Gregory stammered, his face pale. "It is just a paperwork error, a clerical oversight." It was not a clerical oversight. It was the fundamental architecture of the system doing exactly what I had programmed it to do. It was checking for a valid contract. It found none. So, it turned off the lights. I watched the chaos unfold for another minute. Security was trying to usher people out. Investors were standing up, buttoning their jackets with angry, sharp movements. The stock price was likely already plummeting in after-hours trading. I closed the laptop lid with a soft click. In my quiet apartment, there was no panic. There was no screaming. I did not hack their system. I did not plant a virus. I did not do anything illegal. All I did was let the truth reveal itself. I picked up my mug of tea, which was still warm. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. I imagined the scene inside the Nova Shield Tower right now. I imagined the shouting matches, the frantic calls to legal counsel, the desperate search through filing cabinets for a contract they had ignored for years. Gregory had wanted to show the world that he was in control. He wanted to prove that I was irrelevant. Instead, he had just spent millions of dollars to rent a venue and broadcast his own incompetence to the entire world. He had shown them that he was a captain who did not even know who owned the ship. So, I have to ask you, in that moment, watching a billion-dollar company grind to a halt because of a single sentence on a screen, what part would satisfy you the most? Would it be the text itself, proving that the quiet woman in the corner held all the cards, or would it be the look on Gregory Thorne's face when he finally realized that you cannot fire the person who owns the keys to the castle? Because for me, it was not about the destruction. It was about the revelation. They thought they were the masters of the universe. I just reminded them that they were merely guests in my house, and checkout time was 11 in the morning. The morning sun was streaming through my living room blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across the floorboards. It was a beautiful day. The kind of day where the air felt crisp and the world felt manageable. But the peace was interrupted by the vibration of my phone on the coffee table. I looked down at the screen. I knew that number. I had memorized it over the last 5 years. It was the direct line to the Human Resources Department at Nova Shield. In the past, seeing that number flash on my screen would have induced a mild panic attack. It was the number they used to summon you for disciplinary hearings. It was the number they used to announce mandatory compliance training. And as I knew all too well, it was the number they used to facilitate what they politely called structural reorganization. I let it ring 3 times, 4 times. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I wanted them to sweat. I wanted them to wonder if I had changed my number. or if I had thrown my phone into the river. On the fifth ring, I swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened. Ivy. A voice chirped. It was Linda, the director of HR. Her voice was pitched an octave higher than usual, dripping with a sugary sweetness that set my teeth on edge. Ivy, how are you holding up? We have been so worried about you. I remained silent. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning on her end. I could practically hear her shuffling papers, trying to find the right script for this impossible conversation. We were just talking about you this morning. Linda continued, filling the void of my silence with nervous energy. The leadership team feels terrible about how things transpired. Truly terrible. Nova Shield is going through a difficult transition phase, as I am sure you can understand. The market is volatile right now. Investors are uneasy. The engineering team is feeling a bit directionless without your guidance. She paused, waiting for me to agree, to offer a bridge. I gave her nothing. We believe, she said, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper, that there is a path forward here that could be mutually beneficial. Gregory and the board have authorized me to discuss a significant adjustment to your compensation package. We want to restore continuity. Ivy, we want to bring you home. I looked at the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. Bring me home, as if Nova Shield was a family and not a shark tank that had chewed me up and spit me out exactly 10 days ago. They were not calling because they missed me. They were calling because their stock price was bleeding out and their product was bricked. They were calling because I was the only person who knew how to turn the lights back on. Linda was still talking. She was throwing out numbers now. Salary increases, stock options, a signing bonus that was double my annual pay. She used words like reinstatement and strategic partnership. It was a desperate, scrambling attempt to put a bandage on a gunshot wound. I let her talk until she ran out of breath. I let her lay every single card on the table. When the silence finally stretched out long enough to be uncomfortable, I spoke. You cannot afford it, I said. My voice was calm. It was steady. It was the voice of someone who had nothing left to lose. Linda stammered. I am sorry, I think we might have a bad connection. Did you hear the figure I just mentioned? We are authorized to go higher if the base salary is the issue. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the sofa cushion. I am not talking about money. Linda, I said, you do not have enough money in your corporate accounts. You do not have enough liquidity in your assets. I mean this literally, she said, sounding confused and slightly frantic. We can wire the signing bonus today. I opened my eyes. You cannot afford it. I repeated, enunciating every syllable. You do not have enough money to buy back the truth. You do not have enough money to pay for the 3 years of sleepless nights I gave you for free. You do not have enough money to compensate me for the times I stood in front of my team and shielded them from the incompetence of the executive suite. I took a breath. And you certainly do not have enough money to buy back a patent that you tried to bury under a pile of legal paperwork because you were too arrogant to read it. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could imagine Linda sitting in her gray office, clutching the receiver, her script useless against the raw, unvarnished reality I was presenting. She had been trained to handle anger. She had been trained to handle negotiation. She had not been trained to handle a woman who simply did not care anymore. Ivy, please, she whispered, we can work this out. No, I said, we cannot. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I did not slam it down. I did not scream. I did not curse. I simply pressed the red button. The call ended with a soft, digital click. The room fell silent again. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. For years, I had thought that my value was defined by my job title. I thought my worth was tied to how much Nova Shield needed me. But in that moment, I realized something profound. The power was not in the job offer. The power was not in the salary negotiation. The power was in the refusal. It was the most intoxicating feeling I had ever experienced. They had come crawling back, begging for salvation, and I had looked them in the eye and said no. Not because I was petty, not because I was vindictive, but because they could not pay the price of admission. Now, I want to ask you something. Imagine the human resources director of your old company calls you. This is the same company that fired you in front of your colleagues, the same company that treated you like a liability. Now they are on the phone, voice shaking, offering you the world to come back and fix their mess. What would you say? Would you take the money? Would you demand a public apology? Or would you do what I did? Go ahead and leave a comment down below. Tell me exactly what you would say to them. I really want to know if anyone can come up with a line colder than you cannot afford it. This was the turning point, before that phone call. I was just a fired executive holding a winning lottery ticket. After that phone call, I was a player in the game. I realized that by saying no to Nova Shield, I was not just closing a door, I was opening a vault. I was the only one who could turn the lights back on, and I had just decided to leave them in the dark. The phone rang again almost immediately. I did not even look at it. I turned it over, face down on the table. Let them ring. Let them panic. Let Gregory Thorne sit in his office and watch his empire crumble because he thought he could buy loyalty with a checkbook. He was about to learn that some things are not for sale, and revenge, sweet and calculated, is one of them. My heart was beating slow and steady. I felt lighter than I had in years. I stood up and walked to the kitchen to pour another cup of coffee. As the dark liquid filled the mug, I caught my reflection in the window. I did not look like a victim anymore. I looked like a CEO. The game had changed. They wanted me to play by their rules, the rules of employment and subordination, but I was done with their rules. I was writing my own rule book now, and the first rule was simple. When you hold the keys to the kingdom, you do not open the gate for the people who threw you into the moat. I took a sip of coffee and smiled. The real negotiation was about to begin, but not with Nova Shield. I had a feeling that somewhere in the city, another phone was about to ring. And this time, it would be an offer I might actually consider, not because of the money, but because of who it would hurt the most. 2 days after I hung up on the desperate human resources director, the silence from Nova Shield became deafening. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of a boardroom that had run out of options. I spent those 48 hours waiting, but I was not waiting for them to call back. I knew they would not. They were paralyzed. I was waiting for the sharks to smell the blood in the water. When the email finally arrived, it did not come from a panicked executive or a lawyer threatening a lawsuit. It appeared in my personal inbox at 7 a.m. with a subject line that was deceptively polite. Invitation to discuss strategic alignment. The sender was not Nova Shield. The domain name was HelioCore Security. For those outside the industry, HelioCore is the predator that Nova Shield pretends not to fear. They are our biggest competitor in the biometric security space, a company known for aggressive expansion and ruthless efficiency. But it was not the company name that made my pulse quicken. It was the name of the person who signed the email, Elena Ruiz. I stared at the name on the screen, a flood of memories washing over me. Elena had been a senior systems architect at Nova Shield 5 years ago. She was brilliant, abrasive, and utterly intolerant of corporate politics. She was the one who had warned me, over cheap tequila shots after a brutal quarterly review, that Gregory Thorne was a virus wrapped in a suit. She told me he would eventually purge anyone who actually knew how to build things, because our competence made him feel insecure. 2 weeks later, she was fired for being difficult to manage. Now, according to her email signature, she was the vice president of strategy at HelioCore. She did not want a video call. She wanted to meet in person. I agreed to meet her at a small, unassuming coffee shop in the suburbs, far away from the prying eyes of the tech district. I arrived 10 minutes early, choosing a table in the back corner with a clear view of the entrance. I ordered a black coffee and waited. Elena walked in exactly on time. She looked nothing like the frustrated engineer I remembered. She was wearing a tailored cream suit that probably cost more than my car. Her hair was cut in a sharp, asymmetrical bob that screamed authority. She spotted me instantly, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She walked over, placed a sleek leather bag on the table, and sat down without breaking eye contact. "Ivy," she said, Her voice was smooth, lacking the jagged edge of stress I used to associate with her. "Elena," I replied, keeping my expression neutral. "You look expensive." She laughed, a genuine, throaty sound. "Heliocore pays for performance, not for obedience. It suits me." She signaled the waiter for a sparkling water, then leaned back in her chair, studying me with eyes that felt like they were scanning code. "I never thought I would see the day," she said softly. "Ivy Sanders, sitting on the other side of the table, without the Nova Shield logo casting a shadow over her shoulder. It is a good look on you. You look less tired. I am unemployed." "Elena," I said, "I have had plenty of time to sleep." "Are you?" she asked. "Are you really unemployed? Or are you currently the sole proprietor of the most valuable intellectual property dispute in the history of Brighton Falls?" The air between us shifted instantly. The pleasantries evaporated. We were no longer two old colleagues catching up. We were two players on a chessboard. This was corporate espionage disguised as a coffee date. I took a sip of my coffee. "I do not know what you are talking about." Elena smiled again, but this time it was sharper. She reached into her bag and pulled out a tablet. She placed it on the table and slid it across to me. "Do not insult my intelligence. Ivy, we have been monitoring Nova Shield's API traffic for months. We saw the crash during the investor demo. We saw the error message." She tapped the screen. An image expanded. It was a screenshot of the catastrophic blue text that had appeared behind Gregory on stage. "License authorization expired." She read aloud. "Contact Aurora Cipher Labs." She swiped the screen. The next image was a corporate registry filing. We did a little digging. Aurora Cipher Labs LLC was incorporated 3 years ago. The sole signatory is one Ivy Sanders. She looked up at me, her expression a mix of admiration and amusement. She swiped the screen one last time. This image made my breath hitch in my throat. It was a digital copy of the original licensing agreement I had signed with Nova Shield. The very document I had dug out of my closet 2 nights ago. "How did you get this?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. "This is a confidential internal document." Elena shrugged, a gesture of casual power. "Nova Shield is a leaking ship. Ivy, disgruntled employees talk, especially the ones in the legal department who are terrified they are about to be sued for malpractice. We bought a copy of the contract from a paralegal who knew he was about to be laid off." She tapped a specific paragraph on the screen. It was highlighted in bright yellow. It was my clause, the reversion clause. She looked me dead in the eye. Gregory never read page 14. "Did he?" she asked. It was not really a question. She knew the answer. We both knew the answer. "No," I said. "He did not?" Elena shook her head, a look of pure disdain crossing her face. "Typical," she muttered. "He sees the world in quarterly projections. He never looks at the foundation. He never understood that you cannot build a skyscraper on rented land if you do not pay the landlord." She leaned forward, her elbows on the table, closing the distance between us. The atmosphere tightened. This was the pitch. "So here is the situation. Ivy, you have the patent, you have the code, you have the legal right to shut them down. But right now, that is all you have. You have a weapon, but you do not have an army." I remained silent, waiting. "Nova Shield is going to sue you," she continued. "They will drag this out in court for years. They will bleed you dry with legal fees. They will try to get an injunction. They will smear your name in the press. You might win eventually, but by the time you do, the technology will be obsolete, and you will be bankrupt." She paused to let that reality sink in. Then, she dropped the hammer. "Heliocore wants to buy Aurora Cipher Labs." I blinked. I had expected a job offer. I had expected them to ask me to come work for them and rebuild the system. I had not expected an acquisition. "We do not want to rent the technology," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We want to own it. We want to take Aegis Lock, integrate it into our own stack, and use it to crush Nova Shield completely. We want to turn their own flagship product into the weapon that destroys them." How much, I asked. The words came out automatically. Elena did not blink. "We are prepared to open the conversation at $300 million. The number hung in the air between us, heavy and electric, $300 million. It was more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. It was freedom. It was vindication. But I did not smile. I looked at Elena, really looked at her. I saw the ambition in her eyes. I saw the same ruthlessness that I had seen in Gregory, just packaged in a smarter, more competent form. If I sell to you, I said slowly, what happens to the technology? What happens to the privacy protocols I built? What happens to the user data? Elena waved her hand dismissively. That is an implementation detail. We will maximize the asset. That is what businesses do. A warning bell went off in my head. Maximize the asset. That was corporate speak for stripping it down and selling it to the highest bidder. Regardless of the ethics, I had spent years ensuring that Aegis law could not be used for mass surveillance or illegal data harvesting. I had built moral guardrails into the code. I looked at the tablet, at the highlighted clause that had given me this power. I was tempted. God, I was tempted. I could sign the paper, take the money, and disappear to a private island. I could leave the war behind. But then I thought about my team. I thought about the reason I built this in the first place. I had not built it to make a quick buck. I had built it to make the digital world safer. If I sold it to HelioCore without conditions, I was just trading a stupid master for a dangerous one. I would be no better than Gregory. I would just be richer. I sat back in the chair and crossed my arms. The excitement of the money faded, replaced by the cold, calculating logic that had kept me alive this long. 300 million is a cute opening number. Elena, I said, my voice flat, but we both know the valuation of that patent is closer to 1.5 billion if it is deployed correctly. Elena raised an eyebrow. She did not look annoyed. She looked impressed. And, I continued, leaning in, I am not interested in a standard buyout. I am not going to hand over my life's work just so you can chop it up and sell it to government spy agencies. I saw a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. I had guessed right. That was exactly their plan. I am listening, she said. I will not say yes today. I told her, I am going to finish my coffee. I am going to go home. And I am going to think about it. I stood up, picking up my purse. I looked down at her. But if I do this, Elena, understand one thing. It will be on my terms, not HelioCore's terms, not the board's terms, mine. I will not be an employee you can fire. I will not be a vendor you can bully. If you want the weapon, you have to accept the hand that holds it. Elena looked up at me. For a moment, the corporate mask slipped, and I saw a flash of the old camaraderie. She nodded slowly. You really have changed. Ivy, she said. You are not the person who used to cry in the break room anymore. No, I said, turning to leave. I am not. That woman was fired 12 days ago. You are dealing with the CEO of Aurora Cipher Labs now. And she is a lot harder to manage. I walked out of the coffee shop into the bright afternoon sun. My heart was pounding, not with fear, but with the thrill of the game. I had just turned down $300 million because I knew I could get more. Not just more money, more control. I was not just fighting for revenge anymore. I was fighting for a legacy. And as I walked to my car, I knew that the price tag was going to go up, way up. And the conditions I was about to write into that contract would make Gregory Thorne's failure look like a minor inconvenience compared to what I was planning for the future. If you thought the disaster at the investor demo would humiliate Gregory Thorne into submission, you do not understand men like him. You do not understand the breed of corporate executive who believes that reality is just a suggestion and that any problem can be solved with enough confidence and a really good slide deck. For the next 24 hours, Gregory did not try to fix the code. He did not try to call me. He went on a media blitz. I woke up to find his face plastered across every major tech news outlet. The headlines were bold, reassuring, and completely fabricated. One article read that NovaShield had successfully identified and patched a minor licensing glitch. Another headline claimed that service was restored to 99% efficiency. There was a photo of Gregory standing in the lobby of the headquarters, sleeves rolled up, looking like a weary but triumphant general who had just saved the world from a digital apocalypse. He gave a soundbite to a financial news channel that made me laugh out loud in my empty kitchen. He said that the interruption was a legacy configuration error from the previous administration and that his team had worked through the night to modernize the infrastructure. He used the word modernize to describe the fact that he had broken the system. But here's the thing about lies in the software world. You can lie to a journalist, you can lie to a board member, you can even lie to an investor, but you cannot lie to a server. A server does not care about your stock price or your reputation. It only cares about one thing: logic. While Gregory was smiling for the cameras, inside the building, he was forcing my old team to commit professional malpractice. I know this because the back-channel chat was still open on my laptop. The messages from Malik and Aaron were frantic. Gregory had ordered them to bypass the Aegis Lock core verification completely. He forced them to build what we call a facade. They essentially created a hollow version of the dashboard that looked functional but was not actually processing any heavy biometric data. It was a movie set. If you walked through the front door, it looked like a house, but if you leaned against a wall, the whole thing would fall over. They pointed the client login portal to a cached database. It meant that users could log in and see their old data, so it looked like the system was working, but they could not upload new data. They could not run new verifications. It was a ghost ship. For a few hours, it worked. The error message disappeared. The investors stopped calling. The stock price, which had dipped, began to stabilize. Even I felt a flicker of doubt. I sat there in my hoodie, staring at the screen, wondering if I had underestimated him. Had he found a workaround? Had he hired a team of mercenaries to crack my encryption? A message popped up from one of the junior engineers. He wrote that it looked like they had actually fixed it. He asked if maybe the license check was not as hard-coded as we thought. My stomach twisted. Doubt is a terrible thing. It creeps in when you are alone. I started to wonder if my revenge was over before it had truly begun. Maybe Gregory was right. Maybe he could bluff his way through technical reality. But then came the morning. It was 9:17 in the morning on a Thursday. This is a very specific time in the world of enterprise security. It is the peak load time. It is when the banks on the East Coast are fully online. The markets in London are closing, and the tech companies on the West Coast are logging in for their morning stand-ups. The traffic on the Nova Shield servers usually spikes by 400% between 9:15 and 9:30. I was watching the traffic monitors on my laptop. I saw the curve start to rise. It was a steep, aggressive red line. The facade Gregory had forced the team to build was designed to handle light traffic. It was designed for a demo. It was not designed for the real world. At 9:16, the latency numbers started to climb. At 9:17, the dam broke. It did not happen slowly. It happened all at once. The cached database, overwhelmed by thousands of requests for new verifications that it could not process, simply gave up. The system tried to fail over to the core Aegis Lock engine to handle the load, but the core engine checked for the license, and the license was not there. I watched the chat window on my right screen. It went from quiet anxiety to absolute chaos in 3 seconds. Aaron typed that the load balancer was failing. Malik typed that the core was rejecting all requests. And then, the message came back. It did not just appear on one screen this time. It appeared on every single dashboard of every single client who was trying to log in. From the investment banks in New York to the defense contractors in Virginia, everyone saw the same thing. License authorization expired. Aurora Cipher Labs LLC retains core IP. The facade was gone. The truth was back. And it was written in bold, unignorable letters. I imagined the scene inside the Nova Shield conference room. I did not have a camera there, but I knew the layout, and I knew the people. I could picture Gregory, his face draining of color, staring at the monitor while his phone began to ring with the fury of 1,000 angry customers. But the best part was not the crash itself. It was what happened in the room immediately after. According to a text I received later from a sympathetic executive assistant, the room was dead silent. Gregory tried to stammer something about a denial of service attack. He tried to blame hackers. He tried to spin the narrative again, but this time, nobody was buying it. The director of technical operations, a man named David, who had been with the company for 15 years and who usually kept his head down, finally stood up. He was watching the error message blinking on the screen. He looked at Gregory, then he looked at the board members who had gathered for the crisis meeting. David did not shout. He spoke with the exhausted clarity of an engineer who is tired of being told to make bricks without straw. He said that what Gregory called stability was actually just theater. He told them that they were looking at a system that was legally dead. He said there was no patch for this. He said you cannot patch a lawsuit. The word theater hung in the air. It was the perfect word. Gregory was not a CEO. He was an actor playing a CEO, and the curtain had just fallen on his head. By noon, the news cycle had turned vicious. The headlines that had praised Gregory the day before were now dissecting him. The tech blogs were no longer asking if the system was fixed. They were asking a much more dangerous question. They were asking why a leading cybersecurity company did not own its own intellectual property. The stock market, which had been hesitant, now reacted with brutal decisiveness. The stock did not just dip, it plummeted. It was a free fall. Trading had to be halted twice due to volatility. Every time the ticker refreshed, millions of dollars in market capitalization evaporated into thin air. I sat in my living room, watching the red arrows on the financial news channel. I read the internal messages from my former team. They were terrified. Yes, but there was also a sense of grim vindication. They knew that this was not their fault. They knew exactly whose arrogance had caused this. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city. Somewhere in that skyline, Gregory Thorne was watching his career burn to the ground. He had tried to fake it. He had tried to cut corners. He had tried to ignore the person who actually built the foundation. Now, I want to pause here and ask you a question. If you were me, sitting in that apartment, watching the company you built collapse in real time, what would you do next? Because here's the dilemma. I could pick up the phone. I could call David. I could give him the temporary unlock key. I could save the company. I could save the jobs of Malik and Aaron and the hundreds of other innocent employees who were about to lose their livelihoods because of one man's ego. I could be the hero, or I could let it burn. I could let the stock hit zero. I could let the board of directors sweat until they were dehydrated. I could wait until they had absolutely no leverage left, until they were on their knees begging not for a partnership, but for mercy. Save the ship and keep the captain who threw you overboard, or let the ship sink and build a new one from the wreckage. Go ahead and think about that. Because as I watched the news that afternoon, I realized that saving them now would only teach them that they could abuse me and get away with it. If I saved them now, Gregory would claim credit for the solution. He would spin it as a collaborative fix. He would survive. I poured myself another cup of tea. I decided that I did not want Gregory to survive, not professionally. I wanted him to be a cautionary tale. I wanted him to be the example they teach in business school of what happens when you underestimate the quiet woman in the corner. The phone on my table started ringing again. It was not HR this time. It was not a recruiter. It was the private number of the chairman of the board. I looked at it. I let it ring. I was not ready to talk yet. The price had just gone up again, and I wanted to make sure they were desperate enough to pay it. This was not a negotiation anymore. This was a hostage situation, and I was the only one who knew the combination to the safe. Walking back into the Nova Shield headquarters felt less like returning to a crime scene and more like walking into a wake where the body was still warm but the guests were already arguing over the inheritance. The last time I had been in this lobby, security had escorted me out while employees averted their eyes, afraid that bad luck might be contagious. Today, the atmosphere was radically different. The receptionist, a woman who usually looked at me with mild disdain, practically jumped out of her chair to hold the security gate open. As I walked toward the elevators, I could feel the weight of 100 gazes on my back. They were not looking at me with pity anymore. They were looking at me with a mixture of terrified awe and desperate hope. They knew that the servers were down. They knew the clients were screaming, and they suspected that the woman in the sensible navy blazer walking toward the executive elevator was the only person on earth who could make the bleeding stop. When the elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, Gregory Thorne was waiting for me. He looked terrible. The confident, sun-kissed executive who had fired me 12 days ago had been replaced by a man who looked like he had not slept in a week. His tie was slightly crooked. There were dark, heavy bags under his eyes. When he saw me, he attempted to compose himself, straightening his jacket and forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace of pain. "Ivy," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as he stepped into my personal space. I did not stop walking. I forced him to match my pace as we headed toward the boardroom. "Listen," he hissed, leaning in close. "We do not need to make a scene in there. We are all adults here. I am sure we can resolve this reasonably without bringing lawyers into it. We just need to get the system back online before the market closes." I stopped abruptly right in front of the double glass doors. Gregory almost bumped into me. I looked down at his hands. They were shaking. A fine sheen of sweat was visible on his forehead. "I am not here to be reasonable. Gregory," I said, my voice low and steady, "I am here to be accurate." I pushed the doors open and walked inside. The boardroom was freezing. They had cranked the air conditioning up to combat the heat of the crisis, but the result was a room that felt like a morgue. The entire board of directors was present. 12 men and women sitting around the long mahogany table, looking grim. At the head of the table sat the chairman, Arthur Sterling, a man who had made his fortune in the 80s and hated anything he could not control. There was an empty chair waiting for me at the opposite end of the table. I did not sit down. I placed my leather portfolio on the table with a deliberate, heavy thud. The room fell silent. "Ms. Sanders," Arthur began. His voice was calm, the practiced tone of a man trying to de-escalate a hostage situation. "Thank you for coming in on such short notice. We appreciate your willingness to engage in dialogue." He clasped his hands in front of him. "We admit that mistakes were made," he continued. "The transition of leadership was handled abruptly. We want to correct that. We are prepared to offer you a comprehensive reinstatement package. We are talking about a significant equity stake, a seat on the board, and a retroactive bonus for the last 3 years. We want to find a path that is mutually beneficial." He paused, waiting for me to be impressed, waiting for me to be grateful. I looked at him. Then I looked at Gregory, who had taken his seat and was staring at the table. Then I looked at the general counsel, the company lawyer, who was sitting in the corner looking pale. I unzipped my portfolio. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. "I am afraid you have misunderstood the purpose of this meeting. Arthur," I said. I pulled out a stack of documents and slid them across the polished wood. "I am not here to apply for a job. I am not here to negotiate a salary. I am here to inform you about the future of the Aegis Lock platform." Gregory's head snapped up. "Aegis Lock belongs to Nova Shield," he snapped, his voice cracking slightly. "No," I said, "it does not." I pointed to the document on top of the stack. 3 years ago, when this company was drowning in debt and could not afford to pay my team, I offered you a lifeline. I restructured the intellectual property holding to save you $200,000 in registration fees and salary obligations. You accepted that lifeline because you were desperate. I flipped the page to the signature block. "That is your signature, Gregory, right there next to mine. You signed as the chief strategy officer at the time. You approved the transfer of the core IP to a separate entity, Aurora Cipher Labs, LLC, to keep it off the Nova Shield balance sheet." I flipped the page again. "And this," I said, pointing to the highlighted paragraph, "is the reversion clause. It states that in the event of my termination without a transition agreement, the license is revoked. It is not suspended. It is revoked." Gregory stood up, slamming his hand on the table. "You cannot do that," he shouted. "You cannot just take the company's core technology and hold it ransom. That is theft. We will sue you for every penny you have." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my head and looked at the general counsel in the corner. Marcus, I said softly. The lawyer jumped as if I had tasered him. Tell them, Marcus, tell the board if the contract is valid. The room turned to look at the lawyer. Marcus wiped sweat from his upper lip with a handkerchief. He looked at Gregory, then at the chairman, and finally, defeatedly, at me. We reviewed the documents this morning. Marcus stammered. His voice was barely a whisper. The clause is standard for high-risk IP holding structures. I advised the board to sign it 3 years ago because we assumed Ms. Sanders would never be terminated without cause. We assumed it was a formality that would never be triggered. Is it valid? Marcus Arthur asked, his voice like ice. Marcus nodded slowly. Yes, sir, it is valid. Aurora Cipher Labs owns the underlying code. We have been operating on an expired license for 12 days. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush lungs. It felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Gregory sank back into his chair, looking like a marionette whose strings had been cut. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I turned back to the chairman. So you see, Arthur, there is nothing to negotiate. You are currently squatting on my property. Every second that your servers attempt to run my code, you are committing copyright infringement on a massive scale. I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the table. I will not reopen the license for NovaShield. I do not trust this leadership team to manage my technology. A gasp went around the room. Then what do you want? Arthur asked, his composure finally cracking. How much do you want? Name the number. I smiled. But it was not a happy smile. I do not want your money. Arthur, I am going to sell the patent. I let the words hang there. I am currently in discussions with 3 different parties who are very interested in acquiring the Aegis Lock platform. One of them is a private equity firm. One of them is a defense contractor. And one of them, I said, looking directly at Gregory, is HelioCore Security. Gregory flinched as if I had slapped him. You would sell to them, he whispered. They will destroy us. That is not my concern, I replied. My concern is getting the best value for my asset and ensuring it is managed by competent leadership. I stood up straight and zipped my portfolio closed. This is not a threat. Gentlemen, this is not a bargaining tactic. This is a list of events that are about to happen. The auction for the patent rights will conclude in 48 hours. If NovaShield wishes to submit a bid, you are welcome to do so. But given your current liquidity crisis caused by the stock crash, I doubt you can afford the opening price. I turned to leave. Wait, Gregory cried out. He sounded desperate, pathetic. You cannot just walk out of here. We are a family. You spent 10 years here. I stopped at the door. I turned back one last time. I spent 10 years building a house. Gregory, you spent 10 minutes burning it down because you did not like the architect. Do not talk to me about family. I looked at the board members. They were no longer looking at me. They were all looking at Gregory. Their expressions were not angry. They were terrified. They were looking at him like he was a bomb that had just ticked down to 0. One of the directors, an older woman with gray hair, let her expensive fountain pen roll off the table. It hit the floor with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Nobody moved to pick it up. The power in the room had shifted completely. When I walked in, they thought they were the masters dealing with a rebellious servant. As I walked out, they realized the truth. They were the passengers on the Titanic, and I was the only one with a lifeboat, and I had just decided to row away. I walked out of the boardroom and let the heavy glass doors swing shut behind me. I did not look back. I did not need to. I knew exactly what was happening in that room. The sharks were turning on each other, and Gregory Thorne was about to find out that in the corporate ocean, blood attracts predators faster than anything else. News travels fast in Brighton Falls. Bad news travels even faster. By the time I left the NovaShield headquarters, the rumor mill was already churning. The story that the intellectual property for Aegis Lock was loose in the wild did not just stay in the boardroom. It leaked to the analysts. It leaked to the hedge funds. And most importantly, It leaked to the sharks in the defense and security sector who had been waiting for NovaShield to stumble. My apartment ceased to be a war room and transformed into a high-stakes auction house. My phone, which I had previously ignored, became a dedicated hotline for general counsels of Fortune 500 companies. They were not calling to offer me a job. They were calling to see if the rumors were true. They wanted to know if the crown jewel of biometric security was really up for grabs. I did not confirm anything. I did not deny anything. I simply told them that Aurora Cipher Labs was reviewing its strategic options. Silence, as I had learned, drives up the price far more effectively than enthusiasm. Then came the formal offer from HelioCore. It arrived via a courier in a sealed, tamper-proof envelope. Elena Ruiz was not playing games. The document inside was thick, heavy, and smelled of expensive legal stationery. I sat at my dining table and turned to the valuation page. The number was staggering: $1.4 billion. It was an all-cash offer for the full transfer of all patents, source code, and deployment rights associated with Aegis Lock. It was not just a purchase price, it was a weapon, with that kind of capital. I could not only walk away wealthy, but I could also fund a dozen startups. More importantly, if HelioCore acquired Aegis Lock, NovaShield would not just lose a product, they would lose their existence. They would be stripped of their core revenue stream and left to die a slow, agonizing death in the market. It was the perfect revenge. It was clean. It was profitable. It was devastating. But I did not sign it. I picked up a red pen and turned to the section regarding operational control. I began to strike through paragraphs. I crossed out the standard non-compete clauses. I crossed out the section that required me to integrate the team into their corporate hierarchy. I drafted a new addendum on a fresh sheet of paper. First, I established my role. I would not be an employee. I would not be a vice president who could be fired by a jealous CEO 3 months down the line. I would be the chief advisory architect, an independent consultant with an ironclad contract. I demanded veto power over the product roadmap for the next 5 years. If they wanted to change the code, they needed my physical key to unlock the kernel. Second, and more importantly, I drafted the ethical conditions. I wrote that Aegis Lock could never be licensed, sold, or deployed to any government entity with a documented history of human rights abuses. It could not be used for mass surveillance of private citizens without judicial warrants. It could not be integrated into autonomous lethal weapon systems. When I met Elena again the next day, she looked at my red ink and frowned. "You are leaving money on the table." "Ivy," she said, tapping the ethics clause, "we have potential contracts with foreign intelligence agencies that would double the revenue in 2 years. If you restrict us like this, the valuation drops." I looked at her calmly. "Then it drops." I said, "I built this system to protect identity, not to erase it. If you want the weapon, you agree to the safety lock. If you do not agree, I will shred the offer right now." Elena hesitated. She knew that even with the restrictions, the patent was a goldmine. She nodded slowly. While we were negotiating, another player entered the game, a massive defense conglomerate, a company that makes everything from drones to data mining software. Contacted my lawyer. They offered $1.6 billion. It was $200 million more than HelioCore. My lawyer was ecstatic. He told me to take the money and run. He told me that $200 million was not something you walked away from. I asked them one question. Would they sign the ethics clause? Their answer was a polite but firm no. They said their client list was confidential and they could not accept restrictions on deployment. I rejected the offer in less than 5 minutes. When I told Elena that I had turned down a higher bid to stick with HelioCore, she looked at me with genuine shock. She had assumed that this was purely about maximizing profit. She realized then that for me, this was about legacy. It was about proving that you could win the game without selling your soul. While the auction was heating up in the shadows, NovaShield launched their desperate counterattack. They knew they could not outbid HelioCore. They did not have the cash, so they did what drowning men always do. They tried to drag everyone else down with them. They filed an emergency motion in the federal district court. They requested a temporary restraining order to block the sale of the patent. The lawsuit was ugly. They accused me of misappropriation of trade secrets. They accused me of breaching my fiduciary duty. They claimed that Aurora Cipher Labs was a shell company created to defraud investors. It was a barrage of legal noise designed to scare off the buyers. They wanted to freeze the asset. They hoped that if they could tie me up in court for 5 years, HelioCore would lose interest and walk away. I read the lawsuit in my living room. I read the vicious lies Gregory had signed his name to. He called me a rogue employee. He called me a thief. I did not get angry. I felt a cold, sharp focus settling over me. This was no longer a negotiation. This was no longer a business deal. This was a trial by combat. Gregory wanted to use the law as a shield. Fine. I would use it as a sword. The power struggle had officially left the boardroom. It was moving to the courtroom, a place where buzzwords and slide decks do not matter. In court, only 2 things matter: the contract you signed and the law you broke. I called my lawyer. I told him to accept service of the lawsuit. I told him we were not going to settle. We were going to the hearing. The date was set for an emergency injunction hearing 3 days later. The entire tech world was watching. The blogs were calling it the trial of the century for Brighton Falls. On the morning of the hearing, I put on my best suit. It was a sharp, steel gray ensemble that looked like armor. I walked up the steps of the federal courthouse, ignoring the reporters shouting questions. Inside the lobby, I saw the Nova Shield team. They looked like a funeral procession. The lawyers were huddled together, whispering frantically, and standing in the middle of them was Gregory. I stopped for a moment to look at him. He did not look like the arrogant CEO who had fired me 12 days ago. He did not look like the man who had tried to humiliate me on a live stream. He looked smaller. His skin was gray. His suit hung loosely on his frame. He was staring at the marble floor, wringing his hands together. He looked like a man who had just realized something terrifying. He looked like a man who realized that the signature he had carelessly scrawled on a piece of paper 3 years ago to save a few dollars was actually his own death warrant. And today, the executioner had arrived to collect the debt. The Federal District Court of Brighton Falls does not look like a place where dreams go to die. It looks like a place where they are dissected. The room was paneled in dark oak, smelling faintly of furniture polish and old paper. The air conditioning was humming a low, monotonous note that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. On the left side of the aisle sat the legal team for Nova Shield, a phalanx of expensive suits huddled around Gregory Thorne. On the right side sat my lawyer and me. We did not have a team of paralegals. We did not have boxes of discovery documents. We just had a single binder containing 3 years of emails and one very specific contract. The lawyer representing Nova Shield was a man named Sterling, a legendary litigator known for burying opponents under mountains of procedural motions. He stood up to address the judge, his voice booming with righteous indignation. He painted a picture of me that was almost impressive in its villainy. According to him, I was a rogue executive. He claimed I was a bitter employee who had weaponized a technicality to hold a billion-dollar company hostage. He argued that the reversion clause was merely a clerical mechanism, never intended to actually transfer ownership. He used words like bad faith and fiduciary breach repeatedly, trying to make the judge see me as a thief who had stolen the crown jewels. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, watching Gregory. He was not looking at me. He was staring at the water pitcher on the table, his face pale and shiny with sweat. He knew what was coming. When it was our turn, my lawyer did not make a speech. He simply projected a series of emails onto the screen for the court to see. Exhibit A was an email from the board of directors dated 3 years ago. In it, they explicitly discussed the creation of Aurora Cipher Labs. They did not talk about it as a technicality. They talked about it as a liability shield. They wanted to keep the Aegis Lock asset off the main books so that if the company went bankrupt, the creditors could not seize the code. They had approved the structure specifically to protect themselves. Then came Exhibit B. It was the minutes from the meeting where the contract was signed. My lawyer highlighted a quote from Gregory Thorne himself. "As long as the system runs and the investors are happy, I do not care about the back-end legal structure. We can worry about the paperwork later. The quote hung on the screen. It was devastating. It proved that this was not a mistake or a clerical error. It was a deliberate choice to prioritize convenience over due diligence. The judge, a stern woman with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, leaned forward. She looked at the screen. Then she looked at Gregory. "Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried more weight than all of the shouting from the lawyers combined. Gregory stood up, his legs looking unsteady. "Yes, Your Honor," he whispered. The judge took off her glasses and held up the contract. "When you made the decision to terminate Ms. Sanders effective immediately, without a transition period and without cause, did you read this clause?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy and suffocating. The Nova Shield lawyers looked down at their notepads. The court reporter paused, hands hovering over the stenotype machine. Gregory opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at his lawyer for help, but there was no help coming. If he said yes, he was admitting to gross incompetence for firing me anyway. If he said no, he was admitting to gross negligence for not knowing his own contracts. I relied on the counsel of my legal team," Gregory stammered finally. The judge put her glasses back on. She did not look impressed. "The court finds that the contract is valid and unambiguous," she ruled, her gavel hovering in the air. "Aurora Cipher Labs, LLC, is the rightful owner of the intellectual property. The request for an injunction is denied. Ms. Sanders is free to dispose of her property as she sees fit." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. It sounded like the snapping of a spine. I did not celebrate. I gathered my papers, stood up, and walked out of the courtroom. As I passed Gregory, he looked up at me. His eyes were hollow. He looked like a man who had just realized that he had signed his own execution order 3 years ago and had only just now heard the sound of the guillotine falling. 2 hours later, the setting changed from the dusty atmosphere of the court to the pristine, glass-walled conference room on the top floor of the HelioCorps headquarters. The view of the city was breathtaking, but I was focused on the document sitting on the obsidian table in front of me. It was the final purchase agreement. $1.4 billion. The number was written out in words and figures. It was a number that meant I would never have to work another day in my life. It was a number that meant complete and total freedom. Elena Ruiz was sitting across from me. She had a pen in her hand, offering it to me. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. I remembered how I felt 12 days ago, leaving the Nova Shield building with my box of personal belongings, feeling like my life was over. Now, I was about to reshape the entire industry. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. I looked at Elena. "I need to ask you one thing," I said. Elena nodded. "Ask." "One day, the market will change," I said. "The pressure to maximize profit will become overwhelming. When that day comes, and you have to choose between making another $100 million by selling this technology to a dictator or sticking to the ethical guidelines we agreed on, what will you do?" Elena did not answer immediately. She looked out the window at the skyline. Then she looked back at me. Her expression was serious. "I am a businesswoman. Ivy," she said, "I like money, but I also like winning. And I know that if I break the rules you set, I lose the asset." She reached over and flipped the contract to the very last page. She pointed to a clause I had inserted at the last minute. It was a variation of what legal scholars call a Gibson clause. It gave me, as the chief advisory architect, the right to unilaterally revoke the license if the ethical standards were breached. It was a kill switch. "If I choose wrong," she said, "you have the right to burn the house down." "That is the deal." I smiled. It was the answer I needed. It was not a promise of morality. It was an acknowledgement of consequences. I lowered the pen to the paper. The scratching sound of the ink was the only noise in the room. I signed my name, Ivy Sanders. It was done. 12 days. That was all it took. 12 days from the moment I nodded in the boardroom to the moment I signed the death warrant of Nova Shield Dynamics. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. When the news of the sale hit the wire services, Nova Shield stock did not just drop, it evaporated. By the time the market closed, the company had lost 80% of its value. The board of directors demanded Gregory's resignation before the sun went down. He was escorted out of the building by the same security guards who had escorted me, clutching a box of his personal effects, leaving behind a legacy of absolute failure. A week later, HelioCore held a massive press conference to announce the launch of Aegis Lock 2. The branding was sleek, aggressive, and triumphant. I stood on the stage next to Elena, the flashbulbs blinding me. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal raised his hand. "Ms. Sanders," he asked, "you have just completed the most dramatic corporate turnaround in the history of the tech industry. You destroyed your former employer and sold their product to their biggest rival for a record-breaking sum. Do you have any message for the leadership at Nova Shield today?" The room went quiet. Everyone was expecting me to gloat. They expected me to talk about justice, or karma, or incompetence. I leaned into the microphone. I looked directly into the camera, knowing that somewhere, in a lonely apartment, Gregory Thorne was watching. I smiled. It was a genuine smile this time. "Thank you," I said. The reporters looked confused. "Thank you for firing me," I continued. "Thank you for underestimating me. Thank you for not reading the contract. If you had treated me with even a fraction of the respect I deserved, I would still be working for you today, making you rich while I stayed in the shadows. You pushed me off the cliff, thinking I would fall. You forgot to check if I could fly. So, thank you. You made me the person I am today." I walked off the stage to the sound of applause, leaving the past behind me for good. I am not telling you this story so you can dream about a billion-dollar check. Most of us will never see that kind of money. I am telling you this because the principle is the same whether you are making minimum wage or running a department. True power does not live in the corner office. It does not live in the job title. True power lives in the details. It lives in the fine print. It lives in knowing exactly what you bring to the table and refusing to let anyone discount it. Gregory Thorne thought he was powerful because he could fire people. I showed him that I was powerful because I could not be replaced. So do me a favor. Tonight, go home and open that drawer where you keep your old contracts. Read them. Read every single boring line. Know your rights. Know your leverage. Because you never know when the day will come that you need to nod. Say thank you. And then burn the whole thing down. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I am incredibly curious to know where you are tuning in from right now. Are you listening to this on your commute in London? Are you watching this on your lunch break in New York? Or maybe you are unwinding at home in Sydney. Please leave a comment down below and tell me where you are in the world. I love reading them. And if you enjoyed seeing arrogance get what it deserves, please make sure to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel. Hit that like button and smash the hype button so that more people can hear this story. Until next time, remember to read the fine print.